At 34, standing in the middle of our open-concept living room in suburban Denver, I watched my husband of 8 years zip up his second duffel bag without looking me in the eye once. "She's 23, Mark," I said. My voice didn't shake, but inside, every single organ felt like it was tumbling down a flight of concrete stairs. "She was an intern at your firm 4 months ago." "It's not just about her age, Claire," Mark replied. His voice carried that practiced, dismissive tone he usually reserved for junior associates who missed billable hours. "Chloe represents a life I forgot I wanted. You and we became a routine. We became mortgages, dry cleaning pickups, and quiet dinners in front of the TV. I'm 38, and I feel like I'm already buried. Chloe makes me feel alive." "I made you feel alive when you were sitting in a cramped apartment eating instant ramen while studying for the bar exam," I whispered, the stinging heat finally hitting the back of my throat. "I worked double shifts at the clinic to pay our rent, so you didn't have to take out secondary private loans." Mark paused, his hand resting on the zipper of his bag. For a fraction of a second, something resembling guilt flickered across his face. But then he swallowed, adjusted the collar of his designer jacket, and straightened his shoulders. "And I'm grateful for that, Claire. I really am," he said, turning to face me. "Which is why I'm not going to fight you on the house. You can keep the equity we've built here. My lawyer's already drafted a clean separation agreement. I'll cover your health insurance through the end of the year, and I'll take care of my own credit accounts. But I need my freedom. I'm buying into the partnership at Miller and Hayes next month, and Chloe and I are moving into a high-rise downtown." "A high-rise downtown," I repeated, the sheer absurdity of the phrase tasting like ash. "You're trading 8 years of a marriage, a home, and a future for a high-rise downtown with a girl who wasn't even out of college when we bought this sofa." "Don't make this ugly, Claire," he warned, picking up his bags. "We don't have kids. We don't have complicated asset splits. Let's just end this like adults." He walked out the front door. I stood in the quiet hallway and listened to the smooth, muffled hum of his luxury German sedan reversing out of the driveway. The heavy oak door clicked shut, and the silence that settled over the house was so absolute it made my ears ring. In a single 15-minute conversation, my entire life had been reorganized into a neat, sterile transaction. The next 6 months were a blur of legal paperwork and cold, functional survival. I didn't curl up in a ball, and I didn't call him crying. My pride, bruised and battered as it was, became my armor. I signed the divorce papers in a quiet conference room on a Tuesday afternoon. Mark didn't show up in person. His attorney simply slid the document across the mahogany table, pointed to the sticky yellow tabs, and handed me a pen. Once the divorce was final, I realized I couldn't stay in that house. Every square foot of oak flooring, every painted wall, every shadow in the kitchen reminded me of a promise that had been discarded like last week's trash. I put the suburban house on the market, sold it during a summer buying boom, and used my half of the equity to make a radical decision. I quit my job as a mid-level administrator at the regional medical center. For years, I had held a quiet dream tucked away in the back of my mind, a dream I had constantly put on hold while Mark climbed the ladder at his corporate law firm. I wanted to open a specialized, high-end medical staffing agency that connected independent nurse practitioners and specialized surgical technicians with rural clinics and overburdened suburban private practices. I took every dollar I had from the house sale, rented a small, 2-room office in a converted brick warehouse district on the edge of downtown Denver, and launched Apex Healthcare Solutions. The first 2 years were brutal. I worked 80-hour weeks. I lived in a modest 1-bedroom apartment above a bakery, where the smell of yeast and toasted sugar filled my room at 4 in the morning. I ate lukewarm soup out of cans, pitched my business model to skeptical hospital boards, and slowly, brick by painstaking brick, built a network of trusted medical professionals. I learned how to negotiate contracts, how to handle liability insurance, and how to read corporate financial balance sheets better than the accountants I hired. While I was building my life from scratch, news of Mark filtered through mutual acquaintances, whether I wanted to hear it or not. I heard that Mark and Chloe had thrown a lavish engagement party at a rooftop lounge downtown. I heard that Mark had been made partner at Miller and Hayes, splashing his success across social media with pictures of European vacations, custom suits, and a brand new sports car. Friends who tried to remain neutral would occasionally let slip that Mark was living the high life, acting like a man 15 years younger, trying desperately to keep up with Chloe's vibrant, party-heavy social circle. I didn't block the news, but I didn't chase it either. I used it as silent fuel. Every time I felt exhausted at midnight, looking over billing reconciliations, I remembered the way he had stood in our hallway and told me I was just part of a boring routine. By year 3, the hard work began to yield incredible results. A major regional healthcare network faced a sudden staffing crisis across 4 of their urgent care facilities. Apex Healthcare Solutions stepped in, filling 40 critical shifts within 48 hours without a single operational flaw. That single contract put my company on the map. By year 4, Apex had expanded from a 2-room office into an entire floor of a prestigious commercial building. We had 12 full-time internal recruiters, a roster of over 300 specialized nurses, and a revenue stream that allowed me to finally pay off my startup debts, buy a beautiful condo overlooking the mountains, and invest heavily in local community health initiatives. I had transformed from a discarded wife into the founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing healthcare staffing firms in the state. I was 39, financially independent, and deeply at peace with my life. I hadn't dated much, not because I was bitter, but because I was fiercely protective of the peace and autonomy I had fought so hard to build. Then came the spring of my 5th year post-divorce. It was a rainy Thursday morning in late April. I was sitting in my corner office, sipping hot Earl Grey tea while reviewing a massive, multi-million-dollar proposal. We were bidding to become the exclusive primary staffing partner for St. Jude's Regional Medical System, a massive, 7-hospital network that would double our annual valuation if we secured it. My executive assistant, Sarah, tapped lightly on my glass door before stepping in. "Claire," Sarah said, holding a leather-bound folder. "The legal review team for St. Jude's just arrived for the preliminary compliance audit. They're setting up in Conference Room B." "Thanks, Sarah," I said, putting my mug down and standing up to smooth the front of my tailored ivory blazer. "Are the primary external counsel members here too?" St. Jude's mentioned they were bringing in an outside firm to oversee the liability indemnification clauses. "Yes," Sarah replied, checking her tablet. "They retained a team from Miller and Hayes. The lead partner on the file is outside waiting with his junior associate." My heart gave one sharp, heavy thud against my ribs before settling back into its steady rhythm. Miller and Hayes. It was a huge firm with over 200 attorneys in Denver alone. The odds of it being Mark were small. And even if it was, I wasn't the broken, abandoned woman he had left in that suburban hallway 5 years ago. "Show them in, Sarah," I said calmly. I stepped out of my private office into the spacious, glass-walled reception lobby of Apex Healthcare Solutions. The morning rain was streaking down the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, casting a cool, elegant light across the polished concrete floors and modern mahogany finishings. The heavy glass entrance doors swung open. A man in a dark charcoal suit walked in, holding a leather briefcase, his head turned down as he checked his phone. His hair, which used to be a thick, dark brown, was noticeably thinning at the crown and heavily streaked with silver around the temples. His posture lacked the crisp, arrogant posture I remembered so vividly. His shoulders dipped slightly, as if carrying an invisible weight. He lifted his head to address the receptionist. It was Mark. I stood perfectly still near the center of the room. Mark turned his head, his eyes sweeping across the sleek, bustling office space, taking in the high-end decor, the busy recruiters on their headsets, and the brass lettering on the feature wall that read, "Apex Healthcare Solutions, Office of the CEO." Then his eyes landed on me. The phone in his hand slipped slightly, dropping an inch before his fingers reflexively caught it. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood visibly drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sallow gray. He stared at my tailored ivory suit, my styled hair, and the calm, unyielding expression on my face. "Claire," he breathed, his voice cracking on a single syllable like a man seeing an impossible ghost. The quiet hum of my office background noise seemed to drop out completely, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic patter of the rain against the glass behind me. "Hello, Mark," I said, my voice smooth, level, and entirely devoid of the trembling ghost that used to live in my chest. He didn't step forward. He just stood near the threshold, his knuckles white around the handle of his leather briefcase. The junior associate standing beside him, a sharp young woman in a gray suit, looked between us, sensing the sudden, thick atmosphere that had settled over the lobby. "Mr. Miller, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice cautious. Mark swallowed hard, his eyes scanning my face, taking in the posture, the quiet authority, and the subtle lines of time that had replaced the tired, stressed woman he had walked away from 5 years ago. "Yes, Julia," Mark stammered, clearing his throat loudly as he tried to pull his professional composure back together like a frayed coat. This is Claire. Mrs. Sterling." He paused, catching himself with a wince.
"Claire."
"The founder." "It's Miss Thomas," I corrected gently, stepping toward them and extending my hand with a firm, professional smile. "Welcome to Apex Healthcare Solutions, Julia." "Mark." Mark reached out, his hand cool and noticeably damp. His grip was weak, a far cry from the aggressive, crushed velvet handshake he used to practice in the mirror before big court appearances. The touch lasted less than 2 seconds before I withdrew my hand and gestured toward the main glass corridor. "Conference room B is right this way," I said, leading the way. "Our lead corporate counsel, David Vance, and our compliance officer are already waiting for us. We have a lot of ground to cover for the St. Jude's contract." As we walked down the wide, carpeted hallway, I could feel Mark's eyes burning into the back of my neck. He looked around at the bustling workspace, the glass-walled breakout rooms, the giant digital screens tracking healthcare placements across 3 states, and the polished silver award from the Denver Chamber of Commerce resting on the lobby credenza. He had expected to find a modest administrative office. He had expected to find a woman who had spent 5 years surviving on a quiet, comfortable middle management salary, slowly fading into suburban obscurity while he built his high-flying legacy. Instead, he was walking through the corporate headquarters I owned. We took our seats around the long frosted glass table in Conference Room B. For the next 3 hours, the meeting was a masterclass in strict, unyielding professionalism. While David Vance handled the granular liability clauses of the St. Jude's contract, I presented the operational logistics, pulling up data models on the room's main display screen with a tap of my tablet. Throughout the presentation, Mark barely spoke. Whenever he raised a point, his voice lacked its former razor-sharp precision. He stumbled over standard indemnity terms, repeatedly checking his notes, his focus constantly drifting toward me. Every time I caught him staring, I didn't look away. I simply held his gaze with a polite, vacant expression until he looked down at his legal pads, his face flushing a mottled red. By 2 o'clock, the preliminary review was wrapped up. David Vance shook Mark's hand, gathered his files, and stepped out with Julia to finalize the printed revisions in the administrative wing. I stayed behind, capping my fountain pen and neatly aligning my notes in my leather portfolio.
Mark didn't leave.
He stood by the head of the table, slowly packing his laptop into his briefcase, taking twice as long as necessary. The heavy silence stretched between us, thick with 5 years of unsaid words and broken promises. "You built all of this," Mark said quietly, his voice echoing slightly in the glass room. It wasn't a question. It was a hushed, incredulous admission. I picked up my portfolio and looked up at him. "I did. It took 5 years of 80-hour workweeks, but yes, we're doing very well." Mark let out a dry, hollow laugh, staring down at his polished shoes. When we divorced, I thought you'd go back to working for the hospital system. I thought you wanted the quiet routine, Claire. You told me you liked stability." "I liked stability when I was supporting a husband who needed my income to survive his bar exams and early associate years, Mark," I replied, my tone flat and factual. When that obligation was removed, I discovered what I was actually capable of. A shadow crossed his face, a deep, bitter crease forming between his brows. He looked older than 39. Up close, under the bright overhead LED panels of the conference room, I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the subtle sag beneath his jawline, and the exhausted, overworked dullness in his posture. "You look incredible," he said softly, stepping closer to the table. His tone had shifted, shedding its formal corporate edge, reaching for a familiar intimacy that made my skin prickle with instinctual defense. "I barely recognized you when I walked into the lobby." "It's amazing what peace of mind and self-reliance can do for a person," I said, keeping my distance. "How is Miller and Hayes? I assume you're managing partner by now." Mark's posture visibly stiffened, a flick of embarrassment darting across his eyes. He reached up to adjust his tie, a high-end silk tie that looked slightly frayed around the inner collar. "I'm a senior equity partner in the healthcare litigation division," he said, though there was no real pride in his voice. "The billable requirements are intense. 70 hours a week minimum. The firm took on a massive debt structure during the regional expansion 2 years ago, so the pressure on the partner pool is unrelenting." "And Chloe?" I asked, deliberately tossing her name into the conversation like a smooth pebble dropped into a deep well. "How is the high-rise downtown?" Mark's hand froze on his tie. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. He looked away, staring out the glass wall at the rainy city skyline. "Chloe and I parted ways 16 months ago," he said, his voice dropping into a flat, defeated monotone. I didn't feign sympathy, and I didn't gloat. I simply raised an eyebrow, waiting. "She was 23 when we met, Claire," Mark continued, a bitter, self-deprecating edge bleeding into his words. "Turns out, when a 23-year-old grows up, her priorities shift. She liked the rooftop dinners, the trips to Miami, and the sports car. But when my billable hours increased and I couldn't spend every weekend hosting her friends, the vibe vanished. She walked out with half the furnishings in the high-rise and moved to Los Angeles with a fitness trainer." He paused, looking at me, searching my face for a flicker of pity, a trace of the woman who used to rub his back when he was stressed about performance reviews. "It was a mistake, Claire," he whispered, taking another half-step toward me. "Leaving you. It was the biggest mistake of my life. I traded gold for brass, and I've spent every single day of the last 2 years realizing how blind I was." I stood there, looking at the man I had once cried over until my ribs ached. I waited to feel a rush of vindication. I waited to feel the hot, triumphant surge of karma hitting its mark. Instead, all I felt was a profound, quiet emptiness. The man standing across from me wasn't a formidable villain who had crushed my world. He was just a small, insecure man who had destroyed his own life in pursuit of a shallow fantasy and now wanted a comfortable harbor to dock his broken ship. "It wasn't a mistake, Mark," I said softly, my eyes meeting his without a flinch. "It was a choice. You chose to discard 8 years of marriage because you thought I was boring. You thought I was a ceiling, when in reality, I was the floor holding you up." Mark winced, as if I had struck him across the face. "Claire, please, can we just have dinner? One dinner. Just to talk like human beings. No lawyers, no contracts. Just us." Before I could answer, my assistant Sarah tapped on the open door frame. "Claire, sorry to interrupt," Sarah said, holding her tablet. "Your 3 o'clock appointment is here. Dr. Marcus Vance, from the St. Jude's Executive Board. He's waiting in your private office." Mark's head snapped toward the doorway. Standing just behind Sarah in the reception hall was Dr. Marcus Vance, a brilliant, silver-haired orthopedic surgeon in his early 40s, who also happened to be the primary director of the St. Jude's Medical Committee and the co-founder of our regional health initiative. Marcus was handsome, deeply respected, and carried an easy, unpretentious warmth. We had been quietly dating for the past 8 months. Marcus offered me a warm, genuine smile through the glass wall, holding up 2 paper cups from the local coffee shop we both loved. Mark looked at Marcus, then looked back at me. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The blood drained from his face once more, his eyes widening as he connected the dots between my life, my success, and the man waiting for me in my office. "I have to get back to work, Mark," I said, closing my portfolio and picking up my pen. "Julia is waiting for you in the administrative wing with the finalized copies." Please make sure Miller and Hayes submits the revised indemnification riders by Friday morning. Mark stood frozen as I stepped past him, the cool scent of my perfume trailing in the air. He reached out, his voice choked with a sudden, desperate panic. Claire, wait. Is there really nothing left between us? I paused at the threshold of the conference room, my hand resting against the cold frame of the heavy glass door. I turned around to face Mark one last time. There was nothing left the day you packed your bags and left me in our hallway, Mark, I said, my voice steady, quiet, and absolute. You didn't just leave a marriage. You threw away the only person who believed in you when you had nothing. I wish you the best with your practice at Miller and Hayes. But our personal connection ended 5 years ago. Mark looked at me, his lips parted, his eyes searching my face for even a tiny flicker of lingering resentment, anything that would signal he still held emotional power over me. But there was no anger in my eyes. There was only the calm, neutral distance one reserves for a stranger on a crowded sidewalk. He swallowed hard, his posture slumping as the last remaining shred of his pride disintegrated. I see, he whispered. I turned and walked across the bright lobby toward my office. Marcus stepped forward with a warm smile, handing me one of the steaming paper cups. Everything go well with the legal audit? Marcus asked, his voice low and comforting as he glanced briefly over my shoulder toward the conference room. Perfectly, I replied, taking a sip of the warm tea and feeling the tension melt completely out of my shoulders. We're right on track for the Friday deadline. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass paneling, I watched Mark walk out into the reception area. He picked up his leather briefcase from the counter, his movement stiff and robotic. He didn't look back at my office. He kept his head down, stepped through the sliding glass doors, and walked out into the cold, steady Denver rain toward the parking garage. I thought that would be the absolute end of it. I thought Mark would wrap up his firm's legal review, send his junior associate to deliver the final paperwork, and retreat back into his demanding corporate routine. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, the final contracts for the St. Jude's Regional Medical System Partnership were officially ready for signing. It was a historic moment for Apex Healthcare Solutions, a $10 million multi-year agreement that cemented our position as the primary staffing authority in the state. The signing ceremony was set for 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning in the executive boardroom at St. Jude's corporate headquarters downtown. At 9:15, as I was double-checking the executive briefs in my office, my phone rang. It was an unlisted corporate extension from Miller and Hayes. I picked it up, expecting to hear Julia or the firm's administrative secretary confirming the document dispatch. Claire? Mark's voice came through the receiver. It was frantic, clipped, and heavy with a strange, breathless panic. Mark, I said, keeping my tone crisp and professional. If this is regarding the St. Jude's signatures, David Vance is already coordinating with your firm's filing clerk. No, Claire, listen to me, Mark interrupted, his words tumbling over one another. I'm in my car. I'm sitting in the parking structure across from your building. I need 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes. There's something wrong with the indemnification schedules on the St. Jude's file. Something huge. My brow furrowed. What are you talking about? The indemnification schedules were cleared by both legal teams on Monday. They weren't cleared properly, Mark stammered, the sound of rain drumming loudly against his car roof through the speaker. I was doing a final sweep of the liability attachments late last night. The hospital's risk management group inserted an undisclosed third-party arbitration clause. If you sign that document today as it stands, Apex assumes secondary financial liability for any pre-existing staffing claims St. Jude's incurred over the last fiscal quarter. It could cost your firm millions in unallocated damages. I sat back in my executive chair, my instincts immediately sharp. If there's an error in the attachment, why didn't you flag this to David Vance or send an official memorandum through the firm? A heavy, suffocating silence hung on the line for 3 long seconds. Because I didn't find it through the firm's official audit, Mark confessed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I found it because senior partners at Miller and Hayes drafted that clause specifically at the request of St. Jude's former CFO. It was designed as a hidden financial buffer. If I raise the alarm through official channels, my partnership at the firm is over. They'll fire me by noon and strip my equity. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. Why are you telling me this, Mark? Because I can't let them ruin you, Claire, he blurted out, his emotion raw and unshielded. I ruined our life together 5 years ago, and I have lived with that nightmare every single day. I couldn't protect our marriage, but I can protect what you built. I have the unredacted draft writers on a secure drive right here in my car. Come down to the coffee shop on the ground floor. Let me give them to you before you head to the hospital board meeting. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the sound of his ragged breathing. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was this another manipulation? A desperate attempt to manufacture a crisis, so he could play the savior and force his way back into my life? Or was there genuinely a hidden trap buried in a multi-million-dollar contract that my legal team had somehow missed? I'm coming down, I said quietly. Stay in your car. I didn't go alone. I immediately called David Vance, my lead attorney, and asked him to meet me in the building lobby. Within 3 minutes, David and I walked out of the glass elevators toward the underground parking garage beneath our office complex. The concrete garage was dim, lit by harsh fluorescent tube lights that hummed overhead. Damp tire tracks crisscrossed the floor from the heavy rain outside. We spotted Mark's black luxury sedan parked in a visitor space near the secondary exit structure. As David and I approached the vehicle, Mark rolled down his driver's side window. His face was pale, dark circles carved deep under his eyes. He held a small, black USB flash drive in his trembling fingers. Claire, Mark said, his eyes darting nervously toward David Vance before settling on me. I have the original, unedited writer files right here. If your attorney compares the hashtags on these documents with the ones St. Jude sent over this morning, you'll see the alteration. David Vance stepped forward, his expression grave. Mr. Sterling, if what you're implying about Miller and Hayes is accurate, you are exposing your own firm to severe regulatory oversight and breach of fiduciary misconduct. I don't care about the firm anymore, Mark snapped, his voice echoing loudly against the low concrete ceiling of the parking garage. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and desperate. I care about making things right.
Claire, please take the drive.
Look at the files. Let me help you. I reached out and took the cold plastic USB drive from his hand.
Thank you, Mark.
If this is true, I appreciate you bringing it forward. It's true. I swear to God it's true. Mark breathed, leaning back against his headrest as if a massive physical weight had been lifted from his chest. A desperate, hopeful smile began to form on his lips. Maybe after you review it, we can get that dinner? Maybe we can talk about. Mark, I interrupted gently, clutching the drive in my palm. Look out your driver's side window. Mark froze. The small, hopeful smile died instantly on his face. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his head to look through the rain-streaked glass of his window. A sleek gray SUV had just pulled into the parking bay directly across from him. The doors opened, and 3 men in dark charcoal suits stepped out into the damp garage air. Walking alongside them was the managing director of Miller and Hayes, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers from the State Financial Crimes Unit. Mark's jaw slackened, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. What is this?" he stammered, his breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. "Claire, what did you do?" "I didn't do anything, Mark," I said calmly, stepping back beside David Vance as the managing director of Miller and Hayes approached the car. "When you called me 15 minutes ago, I didn't just call David. I called the Internal Compliance Division at St. Jude's. It turns out Miller and Hayes had already initiated an internal audit on your billable accounts 2 days ago." David Vance cleared his throat, his tone measured and professional. "Mr. Sterling, your firm discovered that you were attempting to alter the indemnification riders unilaterally in a desperate attempt to manufacture a conflict. There was no hidden clause inserted by St. Jude's. You created a forged draft last night using the firm's secure server credentials, intending to save Apex and force a personal bridge back to Ms. Thomas." Mark looked from David to me, his face draining of all color until he looked like paper. No, Claire, listen to me. I was trying to protect you. I thought. You thought you could manipulate me one last time, I said softly, the rain outside drumming a steady, heavy beat against the garage ventilation shafts. 5 years ago, you walked out because you thought you were too good for the life we built. And today, you tried to manufacture a crisis, just so you could play the hero in a life you have no right to touch. The managing director of Miller and Hayes stepped up to the open driver's window, his expression cold and unyielding. Mark Sterling, your equity partnership with Miller and Hayes is terminated effective immediately. The board has already notified the State Bar Association regarding corporate forgery and unauthorized access to client files. You need to step out of the vehicle. Mark sat frozen in the driver's seat. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. The illusion of his high-flying career, his custom suits, his arrogance, and his desperate need for control dissolved completely in the dim, fluorescent light of the parking structure. He looked up at me through the open window, a broken, lonely man staring at the woman who had rebuilt her life without him. "Claire, please," he whispered, a single tear cutting a pale track through the dust on his cheek. "I have nothing left." "You had everything, Mark," I said, my voice completely free of bitterness, anger, or spite. "You just didn't know how to value it." I turned my back on the car and walked toward the glass elevators with David Vance. Behind us, the quiet rustle of leather seats and low, official voices echoed through the concrete space as Mark was escorted from his vehicle. I didn't look back once. An hour later, I stood in the executive boardroom at St. Jude's Regional Medical System. The long mahogany table was bathed in warm, clear sunlight as the rain clouds finally broke over the Denver skyline. Sitting beside Marcus Vance and my legal team, I picked up the heavy silver pen and signed my name on the final page of the $10 million contract. When the applause broke out around the room, Marcus reached over and gently squeezed my hand. I looked at him, feeling a deep, quiet warmth settle behind my ribs, a warmth built on trust, mutual respect, and genuine partnership. True strength isn't about proving your worth to the people who abandoned you, nor is it about watching them fall under the weight of their own choices. True strength is built in the quiet, invisible hours when you pick up the pieces of a broken foundation and decide to build something enduring on your own terms. I looked out the high-rise window at the mountains standing tall against the blue Colorado sky, fully at peace, knowing that my story was no longer about what I had lost, but about everything I had chosen to become.